All right, this is Citizenship and Mobility Attorney Parvi Malakouti. Today's July 14th, 2025, and this is our 17th mobility space. We're doing 50 mobility spaces this year on the hottest topics in dual citizenship, freedom of movement, and sovereignty. So today we're talking about springboard benefits of second citizenship. And I guess we should start off by defining. The way I define a springboard benefit is getting a mobility asset, meaning citizenship, residency, or visa, in one country in order to gain increased access to another country. So the country you're using is the springboard, and the destination country is the landing pad. And some common, probably the most common type of springboard benefit that is discussed is visa-free access, right? If you become citizen in one country and citizens of that country have visa-free access to, let's say, 140 other countries, well, then it could be said you're using that second country as a springboard in order to gain access to a third country. So that's what I mean by springboard benefit. And by far, the most commonly discussed one is visa-free access, but there are other types of springboard benefits as well, including arguably some that are even more important, actually more impactful. And that's what I hope to talk about today. So as a reminder, anybody can speak. Anybody's welcome to talk. Just send me a request if you like, and I'll approve it right away. So first category of springboard benefits is obviously visa-free access. A second category is what I call satellite residency rights. Okay, satellite residency rights as opposed to core residency rights. And what I mean by that is having citizenship in a country that gives you access not just to reside within that country, but also to reside in other countries, right? And these, the source of these satellite residency rights is typically bilateral, multilateral treaty or membership in some sort of union, right? So the European Union is the example that comes to mind, right? If you obtain citizenship in, let's call it Hungary, then you have rights of residency, indefinite rights of residency in other countries in the EU as well. Let's say, for example, Spain. But I distinguish those, right, as satellite residency rights. I distinguish those from the right of residency in the country in which you have citizenship, right? And that's for many reasons that we've discussed before, and we'll talk about it today. But the most important reason is that satellite residency rights are not as robust as core residency rights, right? Because it relies upon agreement with third-party countries. So that's a second category of springboard benefits. A third category is what we could call either work permits or let's call it preferred access to third countries, right? So you get citizenship, or let's say you are a citizen in one country, and by agreement with another country, this entitles you to either a work permit in another country or a temporary residency permit, or sometimes just even advantaged terms, right, for being able to apply for a mobility benefit in that third country, that landing pad country. And an example that we've discussed before is, for example, the TN visa, right? So Canadians having preferred access, not just visa-free access to the United States, but preferred terms for access to be able to get non-immigrant statuses in the United States. That's a third category. Fourth category, which is not discussed that much, but is becoming, more and more common, especially as more mobility practitioners try to use this as a strategy. It's what I call the friendlier consulate springboard, or sometimes consular shopping, right? And the idea is that by being citizen of or resident in a second country, you can use third country consulates in that second country in order to apply for a residency permit or a visa in that third country. And this benefit stems from the fact that generally many countries will not allow you to apply for a visa to their country or resident in their country in any consulate abroad. Typically, consulates will kind of divide the world up into different jurisdictions, and they want people who are applying for a residency or a visa to that country to apply at a consulate that is in their jurisdiction. Jurisdiction is usually based off of residency, okay, or citizenship, where the person's resident or citizenship. So the idea is that if you are resident or citizenship in more countries, you have access to more consulates in order to be able to apply for a mobility benefit in a third country. Now, for somebody who's not either a mobility practitioner or never applied for a visa or residency in a third country, that might not seem like it matters that much. I mean, why would it matter to be able to apply in a third or fourth consulate? But if you're in practice or you've been applying for residencies or getting citizenships, you realize that um, being able to apply in different consulates can be a massive benefit, especially if you're coming from a country that is in some sort of either crisis or has some sort of restriction or has some sort of strained relationship with the country that you're trying to springboard to. All of these can lead to either consulates being shut down, delayed, having backlogs in their work, their workload, or basically any other number of factors that can make it difficult for you to actually be able to apply for a visa or residency to that third country using the single consulate that you're confined to, right? So the friendlier consulate springboard matters, right? It's definitely an important benefit, although some people might not know it if they haven't been in that jam, right? And then the fifth category is what I would call basically the more general category of treaty rights, right? So basically being able to gain access to treaty benefits by being citizen or resident in a third country, other than let's call it, satellite residency rights. So this is there's I don't think these are all the categories of springboard benefits, but I think these are kind of perhaps the most important ones, the ones that affect the most number of people. Now, here's the thing: there are drawbacks to a benefit coming by springboard versus let's call it a core mobility benefit, meaning a benefit that a country gives you as a citizen or resident in that country, right? And that's the fact that springboard benefits, right, are dependent on relationships between countries, which you don't have control over, right? So, one springboard benefit that presents today that you could be working towards could change, and they do change, right, from year to year as shifting alliances between countries happen, or different types of political dynamics. So I think that if you're a person who's either American or not American, and you're thinking long term about building up your mobility asset portfolio, long term, second citizenship, third, fourth, fifth, I think the question is, where do you place the benefit? How do you rank or discount the benefit of a springboard mobility benefit as opposed to a core mobility benefit when you're trying to make your decisions about what types of citizenships to work towards, either by period of residency or by, if you're thinking about citizenship, by investment? I think that's the relevant question. Where do springboard benefits, how beneficial are they? What are the attack vectors, and how do they factor in basically to your decision making? So far we got Patrick here, we got Alex. I'm going to kick off the discussion with a question to Patrick. Okay. So Patrick, first question is this. So obviously not everybody's American, but we have a lot of Americans that listen to this. If you're an American, okay, and you're thinking about getting second or third citizenship in another country, do you think do you think there should be less emphasis? Generally, there's less emphasis on springboard benefits for Americans because Americans have such high visa-free access, or do you think that really the analysis for how to value and discount springboard benefits is kind of the same for Americans as, let's say, people from other countries, second or third world countries?
Yeah, great question. I generally think that Springboard benefits, particularly visa-free access, is is marketed more frequently because it's tangible and very easy to understand for the average person, even though it might not be as robust of a benefit compared to other aspects of a second citizenship. Um, I also think that because access to the European Union is so coveted, either for lifestyle reasons or for with citizenship by descent, kind of legacy identity reasons. Um, the springboard benefit of the EU to live in the right to live and work in the European Union is probably the gold standard of springboard benefits for however many countries are in the European Union. I think that that is very easy to understand. But um, that being said, yes, I think that springboard benefits are inherently more valuable to someone who might not be from a North American or European country, or let's call it, yeah, European, EU or AUKUS, Five Eyes countries, just because those countries already have access to 85% plus of the world, whereas some citizenships do not. And so that makes it inherently more valuable, right? The old adage is, how do you price an option? Well, the more variable the underlying, the more valuable your option is. If you live in a world where your citizenship is just uh, in the bottom 50 of the world, based on visa-free access, then visa-free access to a certain level of countries is going to be inherently more valuable, even though it might not be as robust. So, um, you can see why, if you're marketing a second citizenship to someone who doesn't have great global access, that is valuable to them. That's a very easy, for lack of a better phrase, a very easy sales pitch, right? Whereas if you were marketing a second citizenship because of some specific niche benefit, you're just not going to have as large of a broad ability to market that, if that's a service you provide. So you have to do your homework, right? Is Sierra Leonean citizenship for $140,000 worth it to some people? Yes, but that market is inherently more small than, say, um, Canadian citizen. I'm sorry, not Canadian, Caribbean citizenship for twice the price, right? Because of visa-free access, even though it is far more dynamic. So I think as far as springboard benefits go, they're the easiest to understand, and for most people, they are the first thing that they think of as a springboard benefit for a second citizenship.
Yeah, so let's continue with that example of Sierra Leonean citizenship. So, um, hypothetically, let's say you get Sierra Leonean citizenship, right? That of course should entitle you to highest immediate right of entry and residence in Sierra Leone. Then you have the possibility of springboard benefits, right? Visa-free access that Sierra Leonean citizens would have to other countries, possible satellite residency rights. And I'm not sure if there's any that exist right now whereby you don't actually have to file an application, but you can automatically have residency rights in another country. But let's say maybe there are. Possibility of additional springboard benefits through ECOWAS if that ever takes off the ground, right? So, I guess we could obviously, you want to be wary of buying, gold dust instead of gold, right? When it comes to the promise or possibility of a future springboard benefit by joining a union, right? But I think everybody probably considers it, right, to some extent, right? Maybe they, if they're really disciplined, maybe they really, really discount that future possibility. But I think probably everybody puts some value, right? Like if it's Albania, or if it's another country that there's been talk of joining a union that would give more springboard benefits, right? So let's call that a possible benefit, right? The friendlier consulate springboard, right? Ostensibly, right? If you wanted to get a residency or a visa to a third country, and let's say you're from Iran, okay, and you want to apply for a visa to the United States, okay, you have to use another consulate, to a consulate outside of Iran to apply because there are no American consulates in the United States. Typically, you're restrained to one of three, okay, Yerevan, Ankara, or the UAE. And if you get Sierra Leonean citizenship, okay, now maybe you can apply for a U.S. visa at the Sierra Leonean consulate. Maybe that consulate is less backlogged. And then, of course, treaty rights. Okay, so we're talking about hypothetically Sierra Leonean citizenship. We got the core mobility benefit on one side, highest immediate right of entry and residency in the country, and then the possible springboard benefits, right? Now, in addition, Patrick, follow up question for Patrick, and then I want to go to Alex, and we have David here as well. Okay. In addition to discounting, and you and I, Patrick, have both agreed on this before, right? That springboard benefits should be kind of discounted vis-a-vis, in comparison to core mobility benefits because of the reliance on a third party country. But in addition to it's called the general discounting of the springboard benefits. Are they to be discounted even further if the springboard benefits in a country that does not have great relations with the rest of the world, or or maybe they should be, or maybe that's actually a discounted benefit, because if you have, I mean, it's like Taleb's, like concept. If you already kind of at the bottom, right, then the biggest volatility is upside, actually, right? What do you think, Patrick?
Yeah, the old concept, buy low, sell high. Um, I completely get what you say. I would value them differently in the sense that, as opposed to the trend, I'm gonna make this like akin to a financial argument. It's very difficult to trade in the market based on trends and trend analysis, in my opinion. Um, because even though we respond to information, trends, I mean, trends are respond to information, but that information is relative to other information. It's not relative to fundamentals. And so it can make trading on trends difficult, even though fundamentals don't always drive the market. And I think that's true with citizenship. Um, you could say, maybe I, invest in a second citizenship that does not have great springboard benefits, like a Sierra Leonean citizenship. It provides you with, the dynamic and changing benefits of ECOWAS, be that as a union or the individual countries' responsibilities to each other. Both of those tend to be in flux every 10 years, it seems like. But maybe if you think that, in 30 years, you know, there will be a huge benefit to that, then maybe that's the right play. I also think that, whether or not you're planning these things intergenerationally also comes into play. A lot of these citizenship by investment programs, require more capital for your children or your family members. But whether or not that can go in perpetuity is another conversation. Um, there's that, and then there is the changing. Then there's my perspective, which would be to evaluate it based on the fundamentals, right? And so those fundamentals would be: is this springboard benefit something that can change easily by government decree or not? And I'll give you two examples. One is, um, since we have generally an American listener base, Americans now need a visa to go to Brazil. That is outside of the control of the US government. Brazil says, yep, we want to be reciprocal. Americans need a visa. The tourism is taking a hit because, Americans, as spoiled as we are, we don't have to deal with a lot of visas for tourism in the general sense compared to the rest of the world. And so it's a little bit of an arcane process, particularly with when a lot of these governments outsource that function, especially in a digital format. And then whoever they outsource, it takes 6 months for them to get their sea legs up and running, and it creates all kinds of chaos. Um, that is a constraint. That visa is a constraint that is outside of the control of the U.S. government or any U.S. citizen. It's at the whim of another country. Um, Similarly, you can look at a good example would be Italian citizenship. Italians have basically the right to permanent residency through with Panama through their 1966 Italy-Panama Friendship Treaty. And because that's not a government policy set by the executive or a piece of legislative, legislation in a home country, it is in fact a bilateral treaty. So that requires two countries to cancel that treaty, or one to cancel it and the other to, not enforce it. Um, which means that the right for Italian citizenship holders is a lot more robust than, say, like visa-free access. Um, and so I think, if you are looking at a second citizenship, I think it's kind of important to look at the fundamentals of that access. I mean, I'm chatty, so I'll give you a third but brief example. One of the big differences between an American citizenship and an American visa-free access for an American and visa-free access for a Canadian, one of the primary countries that differs is Belarus. Now, do I think that relations between Canada and Belarus are like inherently much stronger than the US and Belarus? No, I don't. In fact, I would think they'd be just as challenged as the United States, given the policy outlook, given the the similarities in U.S. and Canada's energy export dynamics relative to global market and power projection. But it just so happens that on paper, Canadians have visa-free access to Belarus in a way that Americans don't. I would not chase Canadian citizenship because of Belarusian access. I think that that will probably be truncated in the next 10 years. But it exists right now, and it exists maybe as a mistake or maybe as something left over from the past decade, but um, it is inherently probably a fragile satellite benefit. And so I think there's different ways to look at it, but I think getting to fundamentals is the key.
Yeah, great point about not just the robustness of springboard benefits, but also variability within them. Right, a treaty, right, is more calcified than just a an agency policy. For example, Department of State policy, or an agreement for visa free access. Right, therefore, benefits that flow from a more calcified legal authority can be said to be a little bit more robust, right? So that's a great point, and that's definitely something that should be considered. Okay, we got Alex Ogorji here, David Bindel. By the way, that was Patrick McFawn speaking there. I want to start introducing people by their full name here because the audience members might hear something they like and want to go look up one of the speakers. So that's Patrick McFawn, who's a consultant for Citizenship by Descent. Alex, what do you think about springboard benefits and specifically how they should be valued, okay, for a person that's thinking long term about their own mobility portfolio, let's say?
Yeah, I think for most people, springboard benefits are more important than the core benefits. Think of something like EU citizenship by descent. You might have EU citizenship by descent in a country that you don't really have any intention of living, but you'd love to live in France or Spain or Italy, one of the sexier, more popular countries, and you're leveraging your springboard benefits to do that. And I think many people that are interested in, say, Malta or Cyprus citizenship by investment, back when those programs were active, they weren't doing it to live in either Malta or Cyprus. It was because they wanted to have the springboard benefits. So I think that is a huge motivating factor for many people who are doing citizenship by investment. Residency by investment can also, or just residency by other ways, can have some springboard benefits, but generally they tend to be smaller. Although recently I saw the Wandering Investor talk about the Panama passport that's available to residents. It's not as good as the full one necessarily, but there are some some benefits you can get from having a Panama passport as a resident that are quite intriguing. And then also sometimes having a residency card can lower your fees. If you have a Honduran residency card, you don't have to pay the fee to enter El Salvador that they would normally charge Americans. And it's kind of a minor benefit for most people, but it's an example of one that you could get with a residency. And I believe last week there was talk about Mercosur residency cards also giving some benefits as well. So generally, I think springboard benefits are a huge reason why people do citizenship by investment, citizenship by descent, or otherwise pursue second citizenships more than the core benefits.
Interesting. So when it comes to citizenship by descent in Europe, yeah, I definitely agree with you. I do a lot of CBD cases for Americans, and I would venture to say in a majority of them, the person is primarily motivated by gaining satellite residency rights in the European Union, not necessarily for citizenship in. So as far as importance, when you look at it from the perspective of a motivating factor, I definitely agree with you, Alex. I definitely agree with you. But here's the thing, and I'll play devil's advocate, I guess, with my own position, with our position here, because we both agree on this point. people don't necessarily actually understand what they're getting. Okay, they don't necessarily understand, the full strength, the robustness of a particular right. Okay, people, I think the vast majority of applicants, of consumers in this market, they don't have any concept of a distinction between a more robust residency right versus a less one. They just think, oh, okay, European, I'm gonna pick up citizenship by descent in Italy. Okay, great. Now I got right of residency in the EU for the end of time, till the end of time. If they knew more, and that's part of the reason, obviously, that we do this content, right? If they knew more about gradations in the robustness of mobility assets, right? I think they'd be a little less motivated, right? I'm not saying they wouldn't necessarily make the same decisions that they do, but I think they'd be a little less motivated to spend as much as they do for springboard mobility benefits. And I think they'd be a little bit more looking to what's a core mobility benefit. And of course, I've said this before. I know I'm gonna sound like a broken record here, but I mean, I think that type of analysis would illustrate the absurdity of these, like UAE or Singapore being the top passport or the top citizenship in the world. These are both countries that have offer a core residency rights with, in an absolute tiny percentage of the planet, right? But yeah, I definitely agree with you, Alex, that as far as motivating factors, whether for better or for worse, people definitely make a lot of decisions based off of what they perceive to be springboard benefits. Here's a question, open question to anybody who wants to take this. By the way, anybody can jump in. David, if you want to jump in, you don't have to wait for a question. Just cannonball in. That's the way we do things here. So is there anybody here that thinks that of the springboard benefits, and let's just categorize them real quickly. 1, visa-free access. 2, satellite residency rights. 3, preferred third country access / work permit. 4, friendlier consulate springboards. 5, non-residency treaty rights. Does anybody think that among those categories, satellite residency rights is probably not the most valued? I think that's residency rights are the most satellite residence rights are the most valued. Does anybody want to take the opposing position that another one is more valued than that?
So I don't want to take the other side of that argument, but I do want to bring up a story recently where someone clearly valued something more than satellite residency. And I know a couple of you on this will know what I'm talking about, but very recently, um, there was someone from the Netherlands who was awarded a knighthood. And for those of you who don't know, you can be awarded a knighthood from the British sovereign. It's a heraldic title, right? And you can get that if you're not a British citizen or not it's an outdated term, but a subject of the realm, right? The Commonwealth. But you cannot use the title Sir in front of your name. And so this person in the Netherlands pursued British citizenship specifically so that they could get the title Sir in front of their name. That was their motivating factor. And then as a result, they got into trouble because the Netherlands looks down on dual citizenship, particularly dual citizenship that is not inherited, so not by descent. So I think there's limited cases, but there are people out there who are motivated by springboard benefits that are pretty niche. And I only brought it up now because it sounds like something I would do, which is why I'm like kind of laughing when I'm saying it. But I think that there is a niche out there that values something beyond the satellite residency benefits.
Yeah, that was a great story, right? I think I think a few people in kind of our orbit posted about that. Great example of understanding the consequences of naturalizing elsewhere before you do so, and then also a niche, if you want to call it benefit, super niche benefit. I mean, how many people get knighted, right? To have that even be a factor for deciding whether they want to become a British citizen or not. So that's a great example. And yeah, of course, I should have clarified at the beginning. When we're talking about the value of the benefits, we're talking generally, not meaning to everybody. We're kind of taking like an average. There's all different profiles, right? And people that value different things. I had a client a few years ago, South Asian businessman who was a legal permanent resident in the United States who wanted to get Caribbean CBI. Why? He's a high flying business guy, okay, and he's in his peak earning years, okay, and he had to go to manufacturers all across the world, and he was having to get visas basically to go there. Well, this guy, he was already on the path to U.S. citizenship. Okay, by that time, I already informed him that, look, if you're getting Caribbean CBI just for visa-free access, understand that this benefit is under attack. This might not be here in 5 or 6 years. But because of his profile, being the super high earner that he was in the peak of his earning years, and the necessity to be able to visit these partners in different countries, it still made sense to him, right? So this is a guy, and he went ahead. This is a guy that went ahead and got Caribbean citizenship by investment in order to gain the visa-free access, okay, while he was also on the path to U.S. citizenship eventually, okay, and being full well informed by me about the attack vector to visa-free access. So there's no doubt that everybody, the overarching principle is that everybody has to be screened or figured out for their own priorities and circumstances what matters the most. So that's definitely the overarching principle. I'm just having a general discussion about kind of what matters the most to most people. Okay, so I should have clarified that at the very beginning, right? But yeah, there's going to be profile out there that's going to care, above all about the visa-free access, above all about, being able to, be knighted, right, in the United Kingdom. There's no limit to the number of unique scenarios that present themselves in profiles because, human beings are obviously so unique in their circumstances, and there's so many complex factors. Anyway, we got David here. Mr. Renunciation Curious. Okay, so David has been very interested, not necessarily in renouncing, but me and him have had a lot of exchanges back and forth about kind of the difference between renunciation of U.S. citizenship and relinquishment. And we're going to actually do a separate space entirely on that. Okay, we're going to do a space on kind of these little peculiarities, the differences between renouncing U.S. citizenship, relinquishing U.S. citizenship, drawbacks, super niche things. So we'll definitely have a full space on that. And we'll try to get, of course, the GOAT, John Richardson, on to talk about that as well. Okay, so Alex.
Yeah, I have some thought on your question. You're basically asking the core benefits, right? What are some core benefits?
I don't understand the question. What was that?
Well, your question before to everyone, and Patrick answered, was sort of what are some core benefits that are more advantageous than Springboard benefits that people might like, right?
I'm not sure if I asked that specifically. I was asking how would you discount Springboard benefits vis-a-vis like core mobility benefits? But go ahead. That's an interesting question.
Okay, so two that come to mind, or one that comes to mind that's kind of in the James Bond, Jason Bourne, like international man of mystery kind of aspect of the space is non-extradition. So many people are interested in passports that don't extradite citizens. And so that may be a core benefit they're after. They don't have any plans to live in the country, but they're like, oh, cool, Brazil doesn't extradite citizens. It varies slightly if you're a citizen of origin or not, but let's say generally they don't extradite citizens. Therefore, I'm going to give birth in Brazil, get my kid that right, and then I can have a permanent residency and potentially pursue it myself over a year or two. And it's for that core benefit of non-extradition. A second one that I'm a big proponent of is the ability to pass the citizenship on via marriage without residing in the country. I think that's one of the most underrated benefits when comparing EU citizenships, for example, which is probably the most popular category of second citizenships, at least from what I see. And so some place like France, where you can pass your citizenship on to your spouse without ever having to reside in France, is a huge core benefit that I think is highly underrated.
Yeah, great points. So yes, obviously some countries don't extradite their own citizens. That's obviously can be an extra layer of protection. And I believe Carlos Ghosn and Roman Polanski are two super high profile examples of this. Ghosn, of course, is a Lebanese, French, and Brazilian citizen, and he's kind of been holed up in Lebanon since making his dramatic Hollywood worthy escape from Japan. And then, of course, Roman Polanski is still wanted in the United States from, I think, the late 70s, and he's a Polish citizen and a French citizen, and he's been holed up in France ever since. So yeah, that's a great example of a potential benefit of some citizenships. That's a benefit of citizenship, right? I'm going to pick on you a little bit, Alex, a little bit. It's a benefit of citizenship. It's not really related to passport. Okay, it's not a benefit that flows from passport, but there's a related issue which has to do with passports, and it has to do with what's called an extradition substitute, right? And that's the fact that some countries, will not allow you to remain in status in the country if you don't have a valid passport. So I'm talking not just about entry in the country, but actually maintaining a valid passport while you're in the country, okay, as a resident or even a tourist. Consequently, because extradition is so expensive for countries to pursue, right? They typically have to actually go to court, typically in a foreign country, if the person's fighting it and litigate it. One strategy, even before attempting extradition, that many countries do, the United States does it, okay, is to cancel the person's passport, okay, and then contact their corollary on the other side and say, hey, this person, you have our citizen in your country, he no longer has a valid passport, okay, and therefore by your domestic laws, right, he's not, he's no longer in valid stay. And if a person doesn't have a second citizenship and passport, okay, to be able to rely on or be able to go elsewhere, right? Well, they're going to have a hard time even leaving that country. They're stuck in that third country, okay, without status, and they don't have a travel document to go somewhere else on. And they become easier prey for being returned to the United States without having to go through the extradition process, right? And a note on extradition. So because extradition is so labor intensive when the person fights it, and because of the cost involved, the US Department of Justice actually has, a policy, and I've even tweeted about this before. They have basically instruction to their attorneys to effectively make sure that the person is worth going after before they go through all this cost and hassle to actually extradite them. So if anybody wants to look it up, they can basically look through my old tweets. I have a link to the policy memo that's published to DOJ attorneys, basically saying, like, look, don't waste our time and money if it's somebody that's not worth going after. And I think that's really a really good illustration of kind of their internal decision making, right, about how and whether to go after somebody. So great points, Alex. And then that was extradition. What was the second point? Oh yeah, exactly. Passing on citizenship by marriage. Yes, exactly. Yeah, that's a great benefit. And yeah, I would probably classify that as a core mobility, benefit, even though it's kind of in the way that the citizenship is passed. So yeah, that's a great one. France, of course, I think is kind of the most common example, right, of you don't get citizenship right away, right? You have to be married for, I believe it's a minimum of 4 years. But yeah, you can attain citizenship through marriage, true citizenship through marriage, okay, meaning not residency through marriage. Many countries have residency through marriage. Few countries have true citizenship through marriage, and you can do it without being resident in France, which of course is a huge benefit. Great points there. Okay, we got inverted here. Go ahead, Alex.
Maybe to follow up on your extradition point, it could actually be a springboard benefit to go to a country that wouldn't extradite as easily. Because many countries, they have laws about dual criminality, and they won't extradite to places that have death penalty or unfair court systems or something like that. So potentially that could be a springboard benefit as well. If you get a residency somewhere, you can get from that increased protection against extradition.
Yeah, that's a great point. A lot of treaties require dual criminality. That means basically that the crime that the foreign country is trying to extradite you for is criminal. So that conduct is criminal both in the destination extradition country as well as the extraditing country. So if you're charged with a crime in a foreign country, and that conduct is not a crime in the country that you're in, if there is a dual criminality provision in the extradition treaty, then the country may not be obligated by law to extradite you under the treaty. So yeah, that's a great point. I will just say, I'll follow up with that. It's not necessary for a country to have an extradition treaty in order to extradite people. And I think I'm not saying you think this necessarily, Alex, but this is a common point of misconception. People think if there's no extradition treaty, that means there's no extradition between the countries. And that's simply not the case. Okay, they can still, many countries still can and do extradite people. But yeah, you're right. We're not in the business of helping people do criminal things, but obviously, if somebody's wrongfully accused, or doing whatever it is that they can to escape kind of a rogue government or a government that's prosecuting dissidents, yeah, I mean the domestic extradition law as well as the treaties of a country could be a factor for deciding where to get residency. All right, we got Inverted here. I just made you a speaker. Inverted, as always, you know the rules. Jump in whenever you want and speak or ask your question.
This is probably a bit of a beginner question for this sort of a group, so excuse this, but I've never actually pondered this. What sort of countries, what would you have to do to get yourself extradited from the U.S. as a U.S. citizen? I mean, I know you just said that they need to think that it's worthwhile to try and take it on, but it's hard for me to believe that the U.S. would extradite to Russia, but I really have no idea. Is there any sort of formal writings or statutes about that?
Inverted, I was talking about U.S. Department of Justice lawyers seeking extradition, to the United States of somebody that's abroad. I wasn't talking about extraditing people from the United States.
Gotcha. Okay, my mistake. I just jumped on that, but still, same question. What would you have to do to get yourself extradited from the U.S. to somewhere else as a U.S. citizen?
Have to be accused of a crime in a foreign country and have a foreign prosecuting agency motivated enough to try to seek extradition. And as far as the specifics, I don't know off the top of my head, the countries that the United States has, extradites to. It's a little bit too far afield from kind of my area of practice. But the U.S. does extradite people, though, no doubt.
One thing that I would add that is related to U.S. extradition is the U.S. has both a judicial and political process for extradition. So you need to go through the judicial process. Is the request valid? Does it meet U.S. law? Does it violate any rights? And then after that, the Secretary of State has the discretion to honor the request or not. So you could lose the court process. Say there's a treaty with some country that was now on the naughty list from a U.S. perspective, or the person was of strategic value or something like that. Let's say the Japan case with Carlos Ghosn, where a former Green Beret helped to smuggle Carlos Ghosn outside the country. It's quite possible that he would lose the court process because it seems he quite likely broke Japanese law, and the Japanese legal system, I guess there's some controversy that it very high conviction rates and stuff like that, but let's say that it was considered fair enough by U.S. standards, so you could be extradited there. All the treaty provisions are met. It's possible that the Secretary of State is going to say, we're not going to extradite special force people. It's not a good look politically, and so I'm just going to deny the request even though it met the judicial hurdles. So that's something to think about.
Great points. And I just looked up the guy's name. I couldn't remember his name. Michael Taylor and his son, Peter Taylor. And they did serve some time in Japanese prison. And I do believe that they were extradited as well. So yeah, that's a great example.
Would another example be perhaps if you were accused of a crime in a place where you didn't necessarily have the presumption of innocence, where we obviously do have that in the United States? And I won't speak for anyone else here, but it would be one of my greatest fears of ever getting falsely accused of a crime in a place where you don't have a presumption of innocence. It would be terrifying.
I don't know Inverted enough about the inner workings of dual criminality to know whether, there's been an argument put forth that just, hey, I don't know. I don't know if the U.S. has resisted extradition of people based off of just a lack of presumption of innocence in a foreign country. Alex, you know anything about that?
No, I don't know enough to say anything. You can look at the process for extradition. The judicial process will probably outline some of the standards that have to be adhered to extradite. But yeah, that's a pretty niche question, and maybe it's worth having a space on the topic in more detail because it's kind of an interesting thing to think about. But yeah, I couldn't give anything more specific than that.
No worries. My
That's
brain
an
goes down
interest.
rabbit holes.
Yeah, I agree. That's an interesting enough question that I might be motivated to actually look that up and see if there's also case law addressing that as well. So no promises, but bookmark that. I may return to that in a future space. Okay, so go ahead, Alex.
I wonder if anyone has a favorite Springboard benefit that they see people use a lot, they like, or a disfavorite one as well, one that they don't like at all, whether it's people advertising the Springboard benefit or just that it doesn't work as well in practice.
That's a great question. So I'll pick the obvious answer. My favorite is satellite residency rights. I think that's probably the same for a lot of people. I think the Friendlier consulate Springboard is really underrated. And it's underrated because people just don't really understand how much of a problem that it can be to actually get an appointment in a timely manner with a foreign country's consulate to be able to get in and apply for a residency or a visa. So that's one that I'm really a fan of. For about 3 or 4 years, I've been kind of experimenting with utilizing that actually as a tactic in order to get people benefits that I want. And typically, I mean, what I was looking at was trying to quickly get residency in a foreign country in order to be able to access their consulate for people that have, that live in countries that have backlogged consulates. And I found, I mean, so far, still because of the uncertainty and the processing time related to quickly trying to get a residency elsewhere, and of course, the loose strings that attend it, it hasn't been yet for me. It hasn't really been that viable yet as a tactic on kind of like a big scale, specifically just to get a third residency or citizenship. But there's no doubt that if the person, I mean, as a general matter, if the person already has the second residency or the second citizenship, well, then, all that, calculation and trying to see if they can get it quickly and how long it's going to take and how much it's going to cost and whether it's worth it, that all goes out the window because they already have the second citizenship or residency. So my favorite is satellite residency rights. My most underrated, I think, is the Friendlier consulate Springboard / consular shopping.
My favorite is not having to wait in the long line trying to get into Europe if you have an EU passport. And also your spouse, most of the time, unless they want to be a jerk. But allegedly, your spouse is normally allowed to go with you, too.
Yeah, I do think that there's a convenience factor to certain citizenships and their associated passports purely because they fall into some block. I don't know if that qualifies as a resident. I don't think it qualifies as a satellite residency right, but maybe like a transit convenience right. And I would say that, um, as an American, as most of us who are American tend to, have a pretty good handle on that. Because most countries love Americans to show up and spend money in their country. But European access at an immigration threshold is definitely a big plus. Trying to think of some other situations where there might be a benefit. Um, you know, there's obviously benefits. There's obviously programs that are somewhat tied to citizenship, right? If you're an American, you can have global entry. If you're Canadian, you can have global entry. Um, you know, struggling on the I'm struggling on the access from Mexico to the United States. It's either Nexus or Sentry, but those are associated programs with a specific that you cannot get unless you are from a specific, have the citizenship of a specific country. So there's definitely some stacking involved there.
Yeah, it's a great point. So I would put that in what I call the preferred access category. That's kind of the third category that I listed, and that's a great point. Nexus, these little things, these little preferred accesses that beneficial to anybody who gets them, but especially beneficial for highly frequent travelers. So yeah, that's definitely a factor.
And
one that I'm thinking of. Go ahead, Alex.
Like treaty rights, Patrick talked about one, the Panama Treaty with Italy, that allows Italians to basically right away get permanent residency rights in Panama. And I think that's a very cool treaty that could be useful to many American, Italian dual citizens or other Italian dual citizens that were planning to move down to Panama. And they're sad that the easy friendly nations permanent residency has gone away, and they don't want to deal with all the investments and other headaches. And so I think that's a very cool one. And there's a few other treaties that often the treaty stuff goes away over time. But recently I read there was a treaty between Guatemala and Spain that allows Guatemalan citizens to apply for Spanish citizenship upon acquiring domicile in Spain. And that one kind of went away a few years ago. Spain stopped applying it, apparently due to retaliation for Guatemala stopping applying it as well. And so now you need permanent residency before you can request your citizenship, as opposed to just normal residency. But that's another example of a potential treaty right that could be quite useful.
I think, didn't Puerto Rico used to have something going on with Spain where if like a child was born there, they had some sort of expedited right to Spanish citizenship? I'm
Yeah,
not sure if that still exists, but I think that existed at one point.
technically it still exists. Yes. You have expedited naturalization in Spain if you come from a what is considered a former colony of Spain. And so that's a huge benefit to people of Latin American origin. The loophole, and I don't know anyone who's ever tried this, um, but if you are born in Puerto Rico and can present a Puerto Rican um, birth certificate or a certificate of Puerto Rican residency, which you can obtain after having lived in Puerto Rico after a certain period of time.
It's
I think
certificate of citizenship,
certificate of
not
citizenship.
residency.
So do you have to be
Yeah.
born in Puerto Rico, or can you live in Puerto
No.
Rico?
If you're 1 year resident in Puerto Rico, you can apparently get a certificate of citizenship from Puerto Rico. It's like mostly a symbolic thing, but because of this Spanish process, some people have started acquiring that to get the 2-year shortened naturalization timeline in Spain. Now, I don't know anyone who's personally done it, so I don't know if it works or not. It seems there's a lot of people who've gotten a certificate of citizenship. That part doesn't seem as murky. Whether it can be used successfully for your application, I think it kind of depends on the officer and stuff. When you don't have the birth there or your parents' birth there, I think it's a little harder. But sorry, I interrupted.
No problem. And inverted, this is a great point. I was actually about to bring up this other category, which is definitely, in my opinion, a springboard benefit, which is expedited path to naturalization. And Patrick, of course, explained it perfectly. Alex, so about 2 to 3 years ago, I had a spate of meetings with 3 Spanish immigration lawyers, one of which is pretty prominent. And I asked about specifically this issue, okay, whether they had ever had a case where somebody was not born in Puerto Rico, moved there, had 12 months residency, got a certificate of Puerto Rican citizenship, and then tried to apply for Spanish naturalization after only 2 years of residency. And none of them had a case or tried a case. Okay, so in all fairness, it's not like they tried it and then it wasn't successful. None of them had attempted a case like that before or had really a strong opinion on how viable it is. Basically, the answer that I got is that it would require kind of more research into into the law. And I never, it wasn't a burning issue for me at the time, so I didn't really follow up with that. But that's what I found. Granted, that was about 2 or 3 years ago that happened. I haven't really looked into it since to see if there's somebody who's actually done this.
I guess one of us has to test it out, right?
There you go. Guinea pigs. We need more. What we really need, I say we, let's call it the community, okay? The community of people that are interested in multiple citizenship, multiple passport, freedom of movement is it's tough. We need people to come out and say what they were able to do and be honest about it working. But the flip side is we also advocate for people to be private with their citizenships and residencies at the same time too. So there's definitely dueling considerations there. For me, I try not to be too negative, but I think there's so much BS floating around in this space. I hear kind of a lot of influencers implying that something can be done or implying that they've done it, and so many of them I just don't believe it. So yeah, we need more field reports, right? So if there's somebody out there that's done a certain path that's of interest to people, and if this person's already decided, hey, I'm going to go public with this, I understand the risks of not being private on this particular citizenship or residency. Yeah, that would be phenomenal, right? If people would publish their results, and otherwise, people are going to have to find out on their own.
I have some things I'm planning to guinea pig, but I can't talk about them. That's the issue. But maybe in a few years, I'll come out and tell you guys of this great potential hacks. So yeah, to be continued, and I'm going to run, but thanks everyone. It was a pleasure as always.
Sounds good, Alex. So this is Mobility Space 17. We'll have you on Mobility Space 153, okay, to do that one. So thanks for joining. Thanks for your contribution as always.
Yeah, I'll just piggyback on what Alex said, because because of my experience with Italian citizenship by descent and all of the rule changes, is that as soon as something gets really well publicized, I think there's a maybe this speaks to the consular benefits, but the, within every country, the civil service that operates consular and administrative offices, they have a direct voice to government. And if they get tired of seeing something that they perceive as a loophole, or they just suddenly there's this huge demand on their time, and they're sitting there saying, hey, give me more resources, or quelch demand, in the long run, government listens to that. And so I think there's a way to guinea pig something. But I think that's why you see some providers keep some strategies close to the chest, because they know that if they advertise them, A, some people could do them on their own, and B, it would open the floodgates to the extent that that opportunity might get pushed back to the extent that it no longer exists in a few years. So there is a knowledge, convenience, strategic spectrum, right? And it's something to consider when looking at how the stackability of some of these satellite benefits.
No, you're absolutely right. And I mean, this point that you mentioned about, kind of at the agency level, a government, narrowing the access versus widening the access based off of, the political appetite and the demand is so huge. Okay, it's so important, and it's one of the reasons, right, that we always say people that if you have a path or you think you have a path, you better run through that like a running back trying to hit the hole, because eventually it's probably gonna close up, or at least be tightened up. Okay, and when requirements are tightened up, right, you're just at the mercy of how squarely you qualify for that benefit. If you really squarely qualify, let's say it's your mom that's born in a foreign country that has citizenship by descent. Okay, maybe you're not going to be that affected by that. But if you're at the boundaries, at the edges, applying for citizenship by descent, for example, through a grandparent, great grandparent, or with a case in which you need to make your case through substitute evidence, you're vulnerable, okay, to those tightening up of requirements. So that's a great point, Patrick. And then, yeah, of course, a lot of providers obviously, keep things close to the chest, right? And some of it is to not ruin something for everybody by making it too public, right? And I think to some extent, I'm guessing, most providers do this. I've had to do this with specifically with criminal records, right? Americans with a criminal record pursuing citizenship and residency elsewhere. There's some things I know, but if I were to make it public, it could potentially attract, the attention and the ire of some of those jurisdictions. So we have to do that. So yeah, I mean, it's a minefield for the applicant consumer going through, right? Because one provider, could be kind of bluffing about something they've been able to do, or it could be that they're playing, that they're not bluffing, but they've played it close to the chest, just the same way you said, Patrick. Okay, so it's 12:04 Pacific Standard Time. We've been going for an hour and 2 minutes or so. We started at 11:02 a.m. We got Patrick, we got Inverted, we got David, and we have our anonymous listeners. I've been looking at the stats, and we get a lot of, actually more listeners anonymously than not. So shout out to the Anon listeners. We appreciate you tuning in, and whenever you want to participate, if at all, you're welcome to do so. Okay, anything else we want to talk about, or should we wrap this one up a little bit on the shorter side? Springboard benefits of second citizenship, drawbacks, benefits. How do we properly evaluate these? How do we properly discount these?
We've talked a little bit about the Springboard benefit of fast track to Spanish naturalization for nationals of former Spanish colonies. But the reciprocal also works. I think Iberians, Spanish and Portuguese often have a fast track in Latin American countries, and Latin American nationals often have fast tracks in other Latin American countries as well. So I'm curious if there are any particularly, I guess, extraordinary citizenships available or nationalities available in Latin America that somebody with maybe a less desirable Latin American nationality might aim to obtain. Are there any particular ones with great benefits other than, let's say, Mercosur or the one in Central America? Are there any that really stick out?
I can't tell you off the top of my head. I would have to dig into a little bit of research. It's not something I've commonly come across. I do know there are certain Latin American countries that have a preference for other Latin American, or citizens from other Latin American countries, um, mostly because there's some perceived cultural shared experience. And so, similarly, if you look at Argentina, which has been in the news a lot in this kind of, mobility, in the mobility sector with Javier Milei's, decree-based changes to the citizenship, or enforcement rather. Um, it forces everyone to go look at the Argentinian constitution, which says it does favor European, um, like immigrants from Europe. And so, yeah, if you show up in Italy with an I'm sorry, if you show up in Argentina with an Italian passport, an Italian citizenship, they're going to treat, whether or not the letter of the law says that, they're probably going to treat you a lot better than if you are coming from a country that maybe has, how do I put this in delicate terms, has like political economy implications, right? And so, like, for example, the biggest uh, immigrant community right present day in Argentina is people coming from Bolivia. And the political economy, like in most countries, says we don't want as many immigrants from, fill in the blank country that gives us the most immigrants, right? And so, um, depending on the region you're in, whether or not you come from a place like Italy or Bolivia, in a judicial process like Argentina, you're going to get treated differently no matter what, because judges are people, and people have perceptions and political perceptions, and that ultimately boils down to, maybe you're treated the same under the law, but the experience you have going through the process is different, right? So there's definitely those aspects, but I would say the former former colonial hegemon versus former colonial territory is one thing to look at, and then the other thing to look at is the shared experience between a region. um and so I think those are kind of the frameworks to look at it, but it is country specific, so it definitely requires some research.
David, Chile is kind of one country in Latin America that gets kind of, I guess, a bonus or an asterisk put next to it because Chile is part of the ESTA program, so the Chileans get visa-free access to the United States as a designated country, assuming, of course, that they also travel on a passport from a designated country. So that's one that comes to mind as far as maybe a differentiator, right? If the person's not American. And then Patrick, I mean, you're talking about nationality toggling, right? I mean, if you have 2 or 3 national identities, right, and you're trying to go to another country, you're gonna, it's the uncomfortable truth. People get treated differently based off of where they're from, even when it's not in the law, even when it's not in policy, right? In Iran, cheap laborers are Afghan, overwhelmingly Afghan. Okay, Afghan immigrants and visitors get treated differently, okay, than people that are visiting from other countries, from Bahrain or another country. For example, Hungarian citizenship by descent. For a while, applicants from Ukraine and I'm drawing a blank, Serbia, okay, were reporting kind of some more difficult obstacles, okay, to pass as far as to pass over as far as the language requirements, right? Why? Informally, right? I think people think it's because they were perceived to be from countries that were A, outside of the European Union, and B, kind of lesser countries. So this is a huge benefit of nationality toggling, right? And I think a lot of people from, let's call it like the global north, Western Europe, Canada, US, Australia, I think a lot of people think that the beneficial toggle is always from your identity from the third world country to your American identity, your Canadian identity. But that's not the case. Sometimes the toggle actually goes the exact opposite way, right? Especially if you're in a country that is antagonistic towards the United States, either the people or the actual government, right? So really, there's so many countries in the world, and there's so many different dynamics throughout history. Obviously, you can benefit by nationality toggling to from your Canadian or American identity to kind of a country that few people think about or know about, or possibly even to a country that's a so-called naughty country in the eyes of the West, right? So this is definitely obviously one of the benefits of nationality toggling, and the very concept of nationality toggling, right, is kind of hand in hand with Springboard benefits, because you're typically talking about presenting yourself as one nationality over another. Okay, so let's say presenting yourself as nationality A over nationality B, assuming you're a citizen of both, typically in order to have access or to do something in country C. So that's typically a Springboard benefit. So yeah, it's a great point, Patrick, about the relationships, right? So many dynamics. I mean, colonial power, colonial hegemon, countries that have been at war with one another, Iran, Iraq, countries that have had, some sort of great affinity, countries that have a language in common, right? Iranians who travel to Afghanistan report, kind of being treated kind of very warmly. It's a common language, common culture, right? Going back. So there's so many different axes on which people have affinity or disaffinity for one another that, really the possibilities are endless in terms of like what you can do. Nationality toggling, right? If you're a citizen of more than one country. Now, I'm not saying obviously this on its own is necessarily enough of a reason to pursue second or third citizenship. There's other typically more compelling reasons for it, but this is definitely a benefit that's probably under discussed.
Yeah, I'll bring up another Springboard benefit here. Well, I'll bring up 2 because, and they are. It's going to sound cheesy, but I promise it's not as long and open ended as it sounds. But one is kind of the economic benefit, and the other is the educational benefit. Um, Americans, for most of us, those aren't benefits for most of the world, right? Because whether it's true or not, we think we have the best education system in the world. Whether it's true or not, we think we have the best economy in the world. And anecdotally and empirically, salaries are higher here than anywhere else. So, for most people's experience, that's true. However, if you are thinking intergenerationally, um, that the economic opportunity is interesting because of the examples we spoke about, in previous spaces, which is that working holiday. which I don't think is discussed enough because as Americans, we don't have access to that. But a working holiday is generally like a 12-month visa between a lot of former Commonwealth countries. Um, and it allows you between the ages of 18 and 30 to work abroad on quote unquote holiday. Um, and typically you can use that time on the ground. So if you're in Australia, Canada, New Zealand, or the UK, you can go to one of those other countries for a year, use that time on the ground to count potentially towards another citizenship, but also work, which is like really difficult to have otherwise have a company sponsor you or whatnot. And if you're someone who likes, I always use the example of kind of facing the hemisphere where your hobby is at. So whether or not you want to go surfing or skiing, like that's actually a pretty phenomenal way while you're young to pursue an opportunity and potentially stack some global experience. Um, and then on the education front, we've kind of spoken about it before, where we were speaking about the citizenship trajectories of Elon Musk, but he went to school in Canada because he was able to get there because of his Canadian citizenship by descent. So I think that's a lot more valuable of a satellite benefit than, or springboard benefit rather, for people who are not American. But um, but I think it affords you the opportunity to put some time on the ground elsewhere intergenerationally when stakes are low, and it doesn't you going somewhere for a year isn't a huge financial cost to you or your family. That I think that those benefits are not as well known because as Americans they're not really apparent to us, but I do think globally that those are some pretty significant springboard benefits.
Yeah, great point. So work study program is kind of, let's call it a gateway, right, to working and living in a foreign country and accruing time to potential naturalization eligibility. As with all gateway things, right, gateway mobility benefit, gateway drugs, whatever, the lower the threshold, right, the lower the obstacle to get to it, right, the more likely that you're gonna kind of just do it, pick it up and try it, and then it can lead to something that's bigger and better. So yeah, that's a great point, right? I mean, a lot of people who do work study programs, or work study holidays, right, just being able to live in a foreign country, work there, even if it's for a small salary, okay, go through the typical things that you do to live in a foreign country, that can sometimes get them to muster up the confidence to even think and consider the possibility of either full time for a long time living in a foreign country, or possibly doing, like a part time thing, which a lot of people are doing now, especially who work in the white collar economy, right? A lot of Americans, a lot of my clients are splitting time, right? They basically they split time between the United States and a foreign country or a few foreign countries. Sometimes it's 3 months abroad and 9 months in the United States. Sometimes it's 6 and 6. Sometimes it's mostly abroad, but maybe 2 or 3 months in bits and pieces per year in the United States. And you're absolutely right, Patrick. That gateway path of a work study holiday, which of course is a springboard benefit, can sometimes be the thing that provides that. So yeah, great point there. Okay, so we got David here. David, any other questions or comments or anything else that you'd like to speak to? Otherwise, I think we'll bring this home and then talk about what our next mobility spaces will be about.
Nothing further from me.
Okay, great. So we're at 12:18. We've been going for about an hour, 16 minutes. That's fine. This is a little bit of a shorter space. We've spoken about springboard benefits in bits and pieces in, I'd say, nearly every space that we've done so far this year, and I'm sure it's going to come up again. So I think this was a good outline of kind of just what a springboard benefit is, just defining the concept, right? And I think it's so important to just define concepts, and not everybody has to agree on the concept or agree that it's important, but just to define a concept so that people can, talk with one another, right? Right now, if you go online and if you, look up content about visa-free access or satellite residency rights, these types of things, people are just talking about them using different terms, or sometimes they're not even using specific terms. They're just describing the thing, okay, which takes a lot more time rather than having kind of lingo that kind of, even if everybody disagrees on the value of the concept in lingo, at least everybody knows what one another is talking about, right? So I have noticed that there's kind of been a proliferation a little, slowly but surely, of some of the lingo that we've been talking about in these spaces, Springboard benefits, core residency rights, satellite residency rights, all that type of stuff. And I think that's useful, so that we can kind of just continue to intellectually and practically explore these topics, right? And actually share info, right? Because without a communication, there's no sharing of info. And a communication has to necessarily mean that the sender and the receiver agree on what the thing means, even if they don't agree on actually, the importance of the thing or the subject matter. So anyway, that's it. This is our 17th mobility space on the hottest topics in dual citizenship, freedom of movement, and passports. We're going to do 50 this year. We typically do these Mondays and Thursdays at 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Anybody can speak. Anybody's welcome to speak. The question is, what should we do? What should be the topic for our next mobility space? I don't have any obvious contenders right now. I know I have a few queued up that I want to have, but I want to have specific speakers that I'm trying to get in touch with to get them to commit. But does David and Patrick, do you have any suggestions of what to talk about next? If not, I'll do what I do when I don't have a suggestion off the top of my head, which is I'll pick 4 topics from my list and I'll throw it up as a poll. And anybody who's listening to this can vote in the poll or even comment in the poll and express preference for a topic. But I will give preference to a topic if Patrick or David here has one or two that they'd like to talk about. What do you think?
Yeah, so this is just off the top of my head. Doesn't have to be for the immediate future, maybe a little bit further down. But given some of the politics of the last week, it's kind of a culmination of longer discussions around politics of dual citizenship, and I think that maybe we talk, maybe at some point we talk about that, because I think there's a world out there where the concept of dual citizenship is only a political liability and not a personal asset. And I don't think that people have a great understanding about why having multiple citizenships is a personal benefit, even though in their world they don't even really understand that concept. And you see it everywhere, right? It's like, oh, we don't want elected leaders to have dual citizenship, and that argument is kind of old. The whole dual loyalty argument is very, very one dimensional. But I think maybe a more robust conversation around that at some point probably might be good. It will probably attract some spicy comments too, but maybe we add that to the docket at some point.
See, Patrick, this is why I ask you, because you come up with these suggestions that make so much sense and are so timely. I have a strong preference for that, but I do want to hear from David. We're definitely going to talk about that. The question is whether it's going to be next. I think it's probably going to be next. But David, do you have another suggestion?
No, I think that's a fantastic suggestion.
Yeah, that's phenomenal. So dual citizens in government, right? There's obviously, obviously the elephant in the room is, all of this discussion about, American dual citizens, Israeli American dual citizens in government. And of course, I guess attendant to that is basically dual citizenship for federal security clearances as well, right? So these topics kind of go hand in hand. Okay, that's it. That's an obvious, fantastic next choice. So that's going to be the topic for our next mobility space. Thursday, 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, unless I hear, but actually I'll just ask you right now, Patrick, can you do 11 a.m. Pacific on Thursday?
Yes, sir. Roger that.
Okay, great. So we're going to talk about dual citizenship, the politics of dual citizenship, specifically in government, congressional candidates, cabinet members. We could talk about Dr. Oz. We could talk about the Trump the Trump cabinets. Okay, and obviously the practical considerations as well, because a lot of our listeners are people, Americans or otherwise, that are considering, picking up second citizenship. Most of the time, we talk about benefits of it. Okay, and generally, I still think the benefits usually outweigh the drawbacks. But any true advisor, any true consultant or advocate is also going to talk to you about potential downsides, right? And if you're a person that is either currently relies on a federal security clearance or will in the future, or if you're somebody who wants to run for political office, particularly in a jurisdiction in which dual citizenship can be contentious, well, then dual citizenship could be a drawback for you, and it's something that you should think about as the potential downside and possibly even avoid, right? So so I think a holistic view, a 365-degree view, obviously necessitates talking about just about drawbacks too. This isn't just hot marketing to sell a product, right? We like to talk about all aspects. So okay, that's it. So this is going to be the topic. Next topic: the politics of dual citizenship. So government, federal security clearances, etc. That's going to be mobility space number 18. I want to thank Patrick McFawn from Bexelum Consulting. He helps with citizenship by descent. I want to thank David. I want to thank Alex Ogorji, Inverted Fragility, and of course, all of the listeners that listen anonymously. And we'll see you in the next mobility space. Thanks, everyone. Have a great week.